Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you to all of you that decided to attend our presentation this morning, The Next Big Thing in Manufacturing, Your Path to the Cloud. I am Dave Lechlaner, and I am the Director of Product Solutions and Product Marketing for Keyed-In Solutions. For those of you who may not be familiar with Keyed-In, we are a leading provider of native cloud ERP and shop floor management solutions for small and mid-sized custom make-to-order manufacturers. A big thank you before we get into today's presentation to the National Tooling and Machining Association for sponsoring this event today and allowing us to be a co-sponsor. Just a few logistics before we move into the content for today's session. The phone lines, as you have heard, have been muted for the entirety of the webinar. Should you have any questions during the presentation, please do jot them down in the appropriate Q&A panel there that you see to the right. All of the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation today. There will also be a recording of the webinar, and it will be made available to you at the conclusion of the session today. You'll receive a link to review the recording at your leisure, or if you want to send it out to any of your associates that weren't able to attend today, please feel free to do so. If for some reason you don't receive the link, you may contact NTMA directly or myself at the above email address. If you have any questions about the webinar or the content, don't hesitate to reach out to me directly as well. I'd be happy to take your call or answer your email. With that, let's go ahead and get started and review real quickly the overall content for today's session. Without a doubt, I think most everyone on the call today would agree that we're living in some pretty disruptive times. Multiple forces and technologies are converging to make this one of the most challenging and yet maybe one of the most rewarding times in business history. As these various forces and technologies converge, it is becoming almost a business imperative to think differently in how we run our operations, how we interact with our own employees, and how we engage both customers and suppliers. We have reached, I really believe, a real inflection point where optimizing our business systems to deal with these issues is absolutely critical. Many of our core business systems that we have in use today were probably placed into service 20 or 30 years ago, and we have relied upon many of them for many, many years. Although the question often comes up, are they there and capable of managing the challenges of the future? So if you're a key stakeholder in your business, if you're an owner, for example, one of the initiatives you probably want to be considering is evaluating your core business solutions and determining if they can really take you into the next 3 to 5 years. And if you determine that they cannot, what is the plan that you might have in place or might need to put in place to replace those solutions to allow you to better attract new customers, boost your revenue, or maybe even increase your margins? During the course of the presentation today, I hope to help to formulate some answers that you may have to some key questions, like what are some of these disruptive technologies that we are facing now or may very soon affect your manufacturing operation? Specifically, how will things like the Internet of Things or other disruptive technologies help me to maybe better support Industry 4.0 or become that next generation manufacturer? How can you determine if your current shop floor management solution or ERP solution is really future-proof and ready for that next manufacturing age that we are entering? Should you consider the cloud? And if so, when does it make sense to actually start that move to the cloud. And finally, if you decide that it is important to move to the cloud, how can you do it and ensure that your company has the least amount of disruption and can leverage really that most success? I think it almost goes without saying as well that the world, and in particular the world of manufacturing, is changing and is doing so almost at the speed of light. So many of the things that we used to take for granted may no longer really apply. I think it really goes without saying that the world is becoming really more global. We are experiencing growth of population in areas outside of the US and North America. Developing countries, for example, will experience a population explosion with a burgeoning middle class. Conversely, developed countries like ours here in North America or in Europe will tend to experience a population decline. The population growth in what we now consider to be third world countries will ultimately mean that growing middle class, where there's going to be more opportunities, more markets open to us, and potentially more consumers and new consumers for the products that we actually manufacture. In addition, the population here in the developed countries will continue to age. This graying of the population, as they say, will exacerbate such things that we're starting to experience today, like the skills gap issue, as more and more of those skilled manufacturers start to retire with fewer and fewer entrants into the job market. In addition, the aging population will put tremendous pressure on healthcare systems and the mix of products that are going to be needed for that aging population. We are definitely becoming a more connected population as well. It is currently estimated that today there are over 3.8 billion internet users compared to only about 400 million in the year 2000. This seven-fold increase in internet penetration has occurred, not surprisingly again, in those developing countries that I mentioned earlier. This connectedness, I believe, is due in large part to the rapidly changing technology landscape. Take, for example, what has probably happened in just our own lifetimes. Since just the mid-1970s, for example, we have gone from computing power that required billions of dollars of investment, entire rooms or buildings to house those computer systems, and entire staffs to maintain, to in the mid-80s, having the same or equivalent computer power in our desktop computers, to where we're literally at today, where we can hold more computing power in the palms of our hand than that old 1975 Cray supercomputer. And honestly, the transformation, the power, the affordability, the availability of devices driven by these technological advances isn't anywhere near being done yet. Would you believe that by the year 2020, for example, it is estimated that there will be between 30 billion and 50 billion connected devices in use all across the globe on a daily basis? If you do the math, that actually averages out to between 4 and 6 devices per every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. That's pretty unbelievable. As a result, all of those connected people will want to need applications that actually keep them connected. Another amazing statistic is that in just the year 2017 alone, people downloaded over 90 billion applications to their individual smart devices. People, by their nature, obviously want to be connected. on a social level. But I think what's really kind of important is to also understand this need to be connected is actually spilling over into our business lives as well. We expect to be connected to our jobs, to our workplaces, and the people that we work with or the people that we do business with, just like we do on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or Snapchat. This is literally driving the consumption of information in new and pretty innovative ways. Imagine our own lives, for example. 70% of us are checking our work emails every single day outside of normal business hours. 42% of us log into emails when we're on vacation at home or away from home or taking a sick day. 43% of us connect to our emails ahead of the workday to get a jump start on the day. And 91% of us can't put down our smartphones. We're checking those smartphones every 6 to 12 minutes. So ultimately, what does this really mean for manufacturing? I actually think quite a bit. All of this that I just mentioned, the globalization of our world, the technological advances, the level of connectedness, all of this means and will put tremendous pressure on our manufacturing operations. I think it's going to mean in some cases that this disruption will actually drive new business models. For sure, as our world gets smaller, as technology allows manufacturers and consumers from all around the world to interact and to do business with one another easier and cheaper than ever before, it's going to mean that our supply chains will grow and they will become more complex in many, many aspects. As people become more connected and actually want even more connectedness, it's going to mean that our business systems will need to adapt to a new paradigm, that people want to be able to work and interact anywhere. For example, today I'm presenting this webinar from my home office. People will want to access and interact with data in the format they want, through whatever device that they want, any time that they want, and anywhere that they're at in the world. The traditional concept that business and even manufacturing can only happen from 8 to 5 and within the confines of a brick and mortar building is almost going the way of the dinosaur. I firmly believe that where and how business is conducted will continue to undergo some pretty radical changes. And with all this connectedness, with all of this business happening literally again, anywhere and any time, we're simply going to see the amount of data that we have access to continue to expand. For example, studies have shown that 90% of the world's data has actually been created in just the last 2 years. In 2012, to put it into perspective, we actually doubled the amount of data just in that year than all 5,000 years of previously recorded history. And it's only going to get worse, or better, depending upon how you look at it, as the Internet of Things continues to take hold and become entrenched. Traditionally, if you look at how data was generated, it largely came from people. In the future, more and more data will come from inanimate objects and devices or even products that we ourselves actually manufacture. With the advent of microtechnology, nanosensors, 3D printing, the magnitude of data generated from these devices will require that our core business systems become much more adept at dealing with that data and making sense of it. Another case in point, How many of you are actually leveraging robotics or investing in smart controls for your machining centers, or investing in other smart devices on the shop floor? If you are one of those shops that have implemented some of this technology, I would ask you, how is your core business system, your ERP system, actually keeping up? Is your current core business system actually able to take in this data as it's actually generated directly from the machines or from the parts out there on the shop floor? For example, I was just reading an article the other day on the new Boeing 787, the Dreamliner. It is said that for every flight of a Boeing 787, over half a terabyte of data will get generated for each and every flight. Ultimately, the benefit of that data is that we're going to get greater and greater insight, but only if we can actually put that data to work for us. There is honestly no way that we as humans have the power to make sense of all that data by itself. Our systems are going to need to radically change. Our systems are going to need to become smarter. Our systems will need to move beyond just mere administration of that data and visualization of that data to actually helping us to make sense of that data. At the end of the day, the greatest opportunity, I think, for us is going to be when we can leverage that data in a more predictive and proactive way. Wouldn't it be great if our core business systems would actually be able to anticipate when a customer should be placing an order with us? Wouldn't it be great if that system, if our system could actually automatically email that customer with a reminder to place an order? Or to take it to the next level, wouldn't it be great if that email would actually generate an automatic purchase order in our customer system to communicate back to our system and actually create a sales order in our ERP solution? Sounds a bit far-fetched, I know, but maybe, maybe not. Hopefully, that's the way that we should all be thinking. And if you think at all about any of this and start to ask yourself the question, well, how is this really going to apply to me? One of the interesting things that I just recently read as well is that studies are showing that this whole concept of the Internet of Things, that manufacturing will actually be one of the largest industries that will gain the most benefit from all of this data that's being generated. That means, I think, that as we start preparing for really a new way of doing business, we need to start embracing those enablers that are going to help us get there. I'm a firm believer that the cloud, will become the great enabler for the next generation manufacturer. The cloud, I think, combined with everything else that I've talked about, will allow manufacturers to become much more customer-centric, more specialized in what they do, more collaborative, more distinctive, more agile, and more automated than ever before. All of this combined really means that I think if you want to be a leading edge manufacturer that embraces some of these key enablers, that you're going to be able to generate a whole lot more revenue at a reduced cost compared to your competitors. So at the end of the day, how does the manufacturer actually become more cloud enabled? I think there's a number of different things that we can do and we can put in place. First and foremost, one of the important things that I think you need to keep in mind and actually do is get yourself up to speed. Things are going to start changing really, really rapidly. So I think it's really pretty key to keep abreast and connect, there's that word again, with industry experts that are out there. I think the next thing you need to do is kind of understand where you're at today in terms of your own cloud journey as a company. I love this graphic just because I believe it really paints a pretty clear picture of how a typical small manufacturer might start taking advantage of the cloud over time. I'm a firm believer that you don't treat this like a light switch. It's not something that you just magically turn on and you're going to be there. I think it's a gradual progression and an evolution to actually get you to the cloud. You know, one of the key things to really understand as a small and mid-sized manufacturer is all of the different options that you actually have out there, both in terms of cloud as well as the deployment options. Let's take a look at some of the options that you have available to you. First and foremost, as you move to the cloud or as you start thinking about moving to the cloud, one of the first considerations that you're going to have is where is that going to actually be deployed? There's a number of different kind of infrastructures that you could consider. You could actually take your current on-premise solutions and simply serve them up in an infrastructure that's actually located somewhere out there in the cloud. So you're basically leveraging your current investment, not having to buy any other sort of applications. You're just simply taking those on-premise solutions and having someone else actually manage and host them for you. Now, again, there are pros and cons here. One of the key disadvantages of this particular methodology is the fact that those on-premise solutions were actually architected at their core to be run on-premise. They were designed to run on file servers, on workstations, all connected through an internet within the four walls of your business. So there will be some disadvantages if you decide to kind of move to this hosted sort of environment. The next option you're going to have is some hybrid approach, where you may have some combination of your core solutions that are still going to be on-premise. Some other solutions might actually be accessed through the cloud, and then you may have various ways that you actually put into place to kind of access any or all of those applications, no matter where you're at in the world. And then, of course, there is the third option, going 100% cloud, investing in new solutions that were developed in and deployed, especially for the cloud, and not having anything on-premise actually anymore. In addition, as you consider all of the various options in terms of deployment, as you move to the cloud, it's going to be important to consider as well the type of cloud that you might want to leverage. In general, you're going to have two options. You could deploy in a private cloud situation. Private cloud very simply refers to a model where the computing, where all of the IT services, where everything is provisioned in a private IT infrastructure. For some organizations, this means that I'm going to actually manage the infrastructure, to purchase the infrastructure, and to deploy the infrastructure within my own organization. A private cloud is usually managed by your own internal resources. So what that means is that ultimately you and your company will need to have the expertise to manage that infrastructure, to deploy updates, and to support all of those applications for your business yourself. You may actually have different ways that you could leverage private cloud. Private cloud doesn't necessarily mean that you have to manage everything internally. You could actually search out and leverage third-party infrastructure providers, but then ultimately still support it with your own internal resources. Or you may actually ask that third-party vendor to also manage it as well. On the other hand, kind of the reverse side of the coin, as it were, you may actually decide to deploy in a public cloud. When you do that, you now shift the entire infrastructure and, more importantly, the management of that infrastructure to a third-party vendor who also offers up that cloud to other businesses as well. The vendor or service provider in this model provides really everything. They provide the people resources, the infrastructure resources, the virtual machines, the applications, the storage, and everything really at scale to the general public, or at least a good portion or good segment, a good-sized segment of that population. Regardless, whether you decide to go public cloud or private cloud, either service is usually offered on a pay-as-you-go basis or as a monthly or yearly subscription model. Usually, when you look at public versus private, you should see that when you deploy or when you decide to deploy utilizing a public cloud, it's going to tend to be much less expensive than private cloud deployments, just because the cost of the infrastructure, all of those services, all of those resources that are needed are going to be shared amongst a much larger group of people. You know, another critical point of discussion I think that every business has to deal with is really looking very seriously at the pros and cons of actually becoming cloud enabled, especially with their ERP solution. In general, as a manufacturing company moves more and more of their core business processes to the cloud, they should be able to really reap some significant benefits. Traditionally, cloud deployments, especially as it relates to your ERP solution, will tend to be more scalable. In other words, as you grow your business, usually you would not see that same increase in cost when you deploy this sort of solution. Usually in the old on-premise model, as you increase your usage of the solution, as more users came on board using the solution, you would typically see the average cost per user not really decrease. Rather, it would probably stay about the same cost per employee. Generally speaking, with cloud deployments, you should generally see that the cost per individual user will actually decrease as the number of users increase. Another obvious benefit to a cloud solution is the availability. 24/7, 365, anywhere that you're at in the world, because all you really need at the end of the day is an internet. IT costs, especially the upfront IT costs, should be greatly reduced. You don't need servers anymore. You don't need heavy-duty workstations, because if it's true cloud, and I want to emphasize that, if it's a true cloud application, any device that can hit a web address should be able to use it. In addition, the additional headaches of upgrading the infrastructure, upgrading the application, all of that falls now back to the vendor. We should also see, when we deploy in the cloud, much more rapid deployments. More globally connected enterprises are getting back to that concept that we are becoming much more of a global economy. Now, of course, as you weigh the definite advantages, you should also be aware of some potential downside when deploying an ERP solution in the cloud. In some cases, again, I would emphasize, in some cases, there may be limited customizability of the solution. Obviously, the speed and uptime of your own internet connection may come into play. There will be frequent but little updates. Now, again, when you look at that, that might actually be an advantage. One of the inherent issues with traditional on-premise solutions, regardless of the type of solution, is really the length of time for upgrades, how big the upgrades are, and how disruptive those upgrades typically are for the small and mid-sized manufacturer. Typically, in a lot of cloud deployments, you're going to see maybe monthly, if not weekly, new deployments. So that means that the disruption factor almost goes away. The upgrades are going to be much, much smaller, almost invisible to the actual end user. So what could be a potential con, those frequent updates, might actually turn into a huge benefit for you. And then obviously there's the whole security question. So any smart business owner that's considering the move to the cloud should obviously take into consideration all of those potential risks and try to mitigate them. So let's talk security first. Security actually is kind of an interesting concept. Believe it or not, and again, probably not hard to believe, security concerns used to be the #1 reason that manufacturers chose not to consider the cloud. We hear about data breaches almost every month. Today, believe it or not, it's actually done an about face. Security is actually the #1 reason that businesses, and especially manufacturers, are actually choosing the cloud. If you think about it, imagine all of the different viruses and malware that is being developed every single year. Quite honestly, there's no small manufacturer, there's no individual IT person that could ever keep up with it. Now, with that said, you should obviously vet the different cloud service providers and application providers to ensure that they have some pretty rigid security protocols in place. These protocols should include various types of protocols. Your vendor should have preventative controls in place, meaning that they have controls that are designed to reduce or maybe even prevent attacks. They should also have deterrent controls in place, meaning that they basically are setting up a no trespassing sign, that they have standard communication that is available to potential hackers, that clearly articulate the consequences of even trying to hack into that cloud infrastructure. They should also have detective controls in place, meaning that these would be the types of controls that would actually proactively go out and try to detect or react to various vulnerabilities. And then these controls could potentially proactively actually signal other controls to address the issue as well. Another type of security control that the cloud provider should have, or the app provider should have, should be corrective controls. In other words, if something, heaven forbid, actually does happen, what controls do they have in place that actually limit the damage to the data or limit the damage to the end user, and basically would hopefully prevent those incidents from happening again. Quite honestly, there's probably several certifications that you should actually look at as well. Typical certifications might be SSAE 16. These are the articulate the standards, for example, for those controls that I just mentioned. They basically are a series of tests that would actually audit and monitor the accuracy of the controls and the implementation of those controls for those service providers. Another really important certification is the SOC control. Essentially, this is very similar to the SSAE 16 control or certification. It again measures all of the controls that that vendor has in place related to security, the availability of the data, the processing integrity, the confidentiality of that data, and also the privacy of that data. Another certification that's very important if you're dealing with customers or suppliers in Europe is the EU-US Privacy Shield. Basically, this is a certification that replaces what used to be called safe harbor, meaning that basically where data is generated, that's where the data needs to be housed. And then for those of you that take credit card payment from your customers, another important certification for that cloud vendor is going to be the PCI security standard. So again, basically, this is the certification that your cloud vendor has all of the controls in place that you can accept, store, process, or transmit any credit card transactions. Beyond security, again, another key concern as you move to the cloud is again that whole true cost of ownership. You know, there is the argument out there that as you subscribe to a particular solution, at some point there might be a tipping point where actually the cost of the subscription exceeds the cost of the on-premise solution. Many decision makers have that fear that really the longer that you pay for a cloud solution, the more that it's going to cost you over time. What I would just caution you with is this. It's often not really the case. As you do your cost justification, one of the things to keep in mind is, again, all of those costs, besides that initial software investment that you have with those on-premise solutions. Typically, you're talking about hardware replacement every 18 months to 24 months. It's the cost of the IT personnel that you may have to actually manage your own on-premise solutions and the infrastructure that's required, the ongoing maintenance, the training. So again, I would only caution you that if you're concerned about the overall cost of ownership, make sure that you consider all of the elements, not just that upfront investment that you may have. Finally comes the question of customization, or what I like to call configurability. Truth be told, every manufacturing operation is a little bit different. In a traditional on-premise model, you're often left to the devices of the vendor who probably has locked down their application, excuse me, to such a point that you have to conform to their way of doing things. Any tweaks that you can make will usually be pretty superficial and quite honestly, at the end of the day, not get you very far. For example, in a traditional on-premise model, you might be able to customize a few fields. You might be able to change a few of the field names. You might be able to change some of the reports, but it's likely that you're not going to be able to change the business flow or the logic of the system, unfortunately. And if you did want to make a change like that, you'd probably have to pay the vendor to make the initial change, but then time and again repay that vendor for each and every upgrade. Or you might have to buy a bolt-on application that's not core to the solution, and then maybe manage the gap or the disconnect in that functionality with each and every upgrade. At some point, cloud solutions can very often mirror that. If you don't choose the right cloud application as you move your way into the cloud, you might run into the same exact issues. So the moral of the story here is that not every cloud solution is architected the same way. Now, with that whole argument of customization or configuration, what are some key things to keep in mind? Number one, as you choose your cloud solution, it should really meet probably 75 to 80% of what you need out of the box. The system, however, should also allow you to make some easy changes or customizations. You should be able to make those changes without constantly having to go back to the vendor. And those changes should actually be insulated or separated so that you can take those frequent and often updates. So at a minimum, for example, you should be able to change field names or field types. You should be able to add new fields whenever it makes sense, whether it's on screens, on reports, literally anywhere in the application. You should be able to rearrange fields. You should be able to adjust field types on whether they're required or not, or you should also be able to adjust the size of fields. And quite honestly, because every manufacturer is different, you should also be able at some level to change the business logic of the program where necessary to actually manage your own business process. Because at the end of the day, you want a solution that allows you to be more agile at a reduced cost, that allows you to enable you to be different than your competitor. So with that, we're sort of running out of time. Let's wrap up and quickly talk about some more tactical next steps if you decide that moving to the cloud actually makes sense. One of the most important things I think that you need to understand is where you're at today. How do you want to be able to interact with your customer? How do you need to be able to interact with your supplier? What's your level of employee knowledge and expertise and engagement? What's your ability to adopt new technology? What's your cultural ability to be able to do that? I then think you need to focus on those key things that are going to give you the greatest return. Definitely moving to the cloud, from my standpoint, is an evolution, not a revolution. You also need to understand your roadblocks to success. Typically, a lot of those roadblocks are going to come down to culture. I think you need to engage with the right technology partners. You need to really identify what I would kind of call trusted advisors. And I also think you need to also stay committed. Then I think the last thing is create that plan. Identify those applications and processes that you're currently utilizing today. Analyze and assess how those applications and how those business processes perform in your existing environment, and have you really optimize those currently before you actually decide to move them to the cloud. I think you then want to decide which applications, which processes, which tasks make the most sense to migrate to the cloud first. Again, it may not be an all or nothing migration. Then I think you need to actually act. Start to move some of those things to the cloud. Start to make that investment, as it were. Start to actually run parts of the business in that cloud environment. Measuring, just like any new initiative, is going to be very important. Compare how you're doing with those applications in the cloud compared to how they used to run and how you used to use them before on-premise. And then finally, it's a constant battle to really optimize everything that you're doing. With that, I think I'd like to go ahead and close the formal part of the presentation. I'd like to thank the National Tooling and Machining Association for allowing us today to co-sponsor this event. I hope you all found the content worthwhile and beneficial. Again, there's a lot of noise and hype out there. I think it's really important to kind of wade through all of that to really understand where you're at today and where you want to be in the next 2 to 3 years, and really start to put in those things in place that will allow you to get there. At this time, let's take a look at maybe some of the questions that have come up. Again, if you have any questions that you think of after the presentation today, don't hesitate to, again, reach out, either contact me by email or by phone, as the case may be. With that, let's take a look at the Q&A panel. We do have a couple of questions that actually came up in the Q&A panel. Let's go ahead and take those real quick. The first one was, I'm a small manufacturing company, less than 20 employees. When is the right time to actually think about ERP and how we might move that to the cloud? The short answer is there's probably never a best time. You're all running your own operations. You probably have a normal 8 to 5 job already. So there's probably never a good time. But with that said, I would think that every day is actually a good time. You know, it really is not going to depend so much on the size of company, necessarily by employee or by revenue. It's really, what is your business need? And I would consider the cloud no different than any other business decision. If you have reached a point where the current systems that you're using, whether manual or computerized or on-premise today, is not meeting your needs, it's a good time to start looking at and at least engaging with vendors and other partners that are out there that can help you make that decision. So again, I don't think it's necessarily the size of the company so much as so much what is your business need. And if your current solutions that you have in place aren't meeting that need, it's probably a good time to move over. One other question real quick, and then it doesn't look like we have any others. I hear the terms single tenant and multi-tenant cloud. What's the difference in layman's terms? Yeah, great question. It actually gets back a little bit to what we talked about earlier in the presentation, and it's really, quite honestly, a deployment and management model. Basically, in a single tenant environment, that means one company is on one set of infrastructure running their own set of applications. So as we look at single tenant, because it's generally a one-to-one relationship, even though it might be in the cloud, your cost of ownership is probably going to be significantly different because that vendor is setting up an infrastructure and basically presenting those applications for your business and your business alone, versus a multi-tenant. Again, multi-tenant typically is one set of infrastructure, one set of applications, but presented out to many, many potential consumers. So imagine, for example, a cloud ERP manufacturing solution. In a multi-tenant environment, you might actually have dozens, if not hundreds of customers basically accessing one set of applications on one set of infrastructure. And so the vendor in that particular case can actually be very economical in sharing the costs, those fixed costs, across many, many more users. Now, the thing to keep in mind, even in a multi-tenant environment, each company's data can be segregated, right? So if there is any privacy concern and you don't want your data mixed with anyone else, even in a multi-tenant environment, the vendor has capability to segregate and secure your data from everyone else. So you would have separate databases, for example, but again, still share the infrastructure and all of the related applications, as it were. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions at this point. So I do want to just reach back out to all of the attendees today for staying on during the course of the webinar. We really appreciate that. Again, if you have any questions, concerns, or thoughts, or want to do any sort of follow-up, I would encourage that. Please do reach out to me with the email address provided or at the phone number there that I have listed. Again, thank you so much. We know you're busy. We'll let you go back to work. Have a great afternoon, and thanks again for attending.